another lesson from history. Newly published book about Winston Churchill called God and Churchill, written by the great grandson of the great man, Jonathan Sands, tracing threads within the life of Winston Churchill, who wasn't an openly professing Christian. You might call him a high Anglican. He came from aristocratic circles, went to schools like Harrow, where they have chapel, and he would have learnt much about our Christian heritage, to the extent that he was able to say during the dark days of the war that we are here to defend Christian civilization. But in Churchill's personal walk with God, there's a very interesting section in this book where after he was captured during the Boer War and was a prisoner, and the whole of the media were following this amazing drama of, where was Winston Churchill when he had escaped. He managed to get away from the prison up to Pretoria, and he was at a very low point. He hadn't eaten, he obviously had been deprived of sleep, and he was desperate now to find someone who would be friendly towards him. Churchill himself describes being in a hopeless state and then saying a prayer. This is the lesson from history, which could have changed the whole face of the 20th century. It could have meant that he never, there was a shoot to kill order on Churchill, and he was high profile, and maybe they wouldn't have killed him, but the fame that accompanied him, his successful escape, meant that he was elected Member of Parliament for Oldham, and then was able to cause all sorts of mischief in Parliament before he went out into the wilderness politically, and eventually found his way back in 1940. But he said this little prayer, and then he said, inexplicably, a hope rose up within me, something that was not rational. He suddenly was filled with courage, and it was as though the Spirit of God had come into his life, and he said he saw some lights flickering on the horizon. He underestimated the distance, but there they were, and he walked towards these lights, and he found a settlement. And not one in a million, but a very faint chance of finding anyone who would be friendly in a hostile settlement. It was a coal mining area. He found a British family. He basically was bold enough to knock on the door, and the door opened, and who should open it but a British company from Oldham, amazingly related to folks in Oldham. And they were able to give him sustenance, and he eventually made his way over the border and became as famous as he is today. So the lesson from history, from the life of Winston Churchill, who of course we remember all his volumes of the English-speaking peoples, his wonderful history of his ancestor Marlborough, who we might discuss on a future occasion. But this little snippet from his life, which I would say, and I think Jonathan Sands would say, and endorsed, interestingly, by James Baker, the Secretary of State under George Bush Senior, that God does intervene in the affairs of men. To those who are humble enough to seek his help and his assistance. Bear in mind that not only Churchill, but the King had a deep awareness of the need for God's help during the war, and of course called for a national day of prayer, which turned to the course of the Battle of Britain, and then amazingly that other national day of prayer at that lowest point when we had over 300,000 troops there at the beaches of Dunkirk. A mist came over, the water was calm, there was prayer for their deliverance, and amazingly, as Churchill describes, one of the great victories of the war was the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force, who could then return to confront the evils of Hitler and his wicked gang, as Churchill would say. And this wonderful line I'll end with: these are not dark days. If you think we've got dark days today, these are great days.